Bizarre Global. In September 1994, a quiet primary school in rural Zimbabwe became the scene of a chilling mystery. Dozens of schoolchildren returned from recess with an unbelievable story. A close encounter with a UFO and its otherworldly occupants. The Ariel School incident, as it became known, is still regarded as one of the most significant and haunting UFO encounters on record. This documentary-style account will retrace that eerie day, the emotional testimonies of the schoolchildren, the community's stunned reaction, and the investigation by Harvard psychiatrist Dr. John Mack. Was it a frightening authentic encounter or a case of mass hysteria? The truth, even decades later, remains as elusive as the visitors themselves. Ruwa was a small agricultural community about 20 kilometers from Harare, little more than a rural crossroads. Ariel School, an upscale private elementary school, in this tranquil setting would become an unlikely stage for a bizarre event. Friday, September 16, 1994 was a typical sunny day. Around 10 a.m., while the teachers were indoors in a staff meeting, over 100 children, ages between 6 and 12, were outside enjoying their mid-morning break. Laughter and play echoed across the schoolyard. Then abruptly, that ordinary morning turned into something that the children would never forget. It began with a flicker of light beyond the far end of the playground. Several children spotted a shiny object in the sky. It looked like it was glinting in the trees. It looked like a round disc, one child later recalled. The disc-shaped craft silently descended and came to rest in the scrub brush just outside the school's perimeter. Dozens of children ran to the edge of the yard to get a closer look, thinking at first it might be an airplane or a trick of the light. But what they saw defied any ordinary explanation. Another student described seeing something silver amongst the trees, and then a person in black next to it. After a moment, one or more small figures emerged from the craft. Between 1 and 4 creatures with big eyes, dressed in all black, stepped out and approached the children. The beings were child-sized, roughly a meter tall, but otherwise didn't look human. Witnesses later described their appearance in eerie detail. One little boy said the creatures had long black hair, and its eyes, which were lower on the face than ours, were large and elongated. Its face had only a thin slit for a mouth and hardly any ears. The entity's eyes were said to be huge, black, and mesmerizing. "You can't just not look at them," one girl would say. In that moment, many of the children felt pure terror. A few burst into tears on the spot. As the dark-clad figures drew closer, pandemonium erupted. Some of the younger children screamed and ran back towards the school building, yelling for help. Older, perhaps braver students remained frozen in place, enthralled and equally frightened in measure. Later, several children, independently of each other, will report that the being's gaze seemed to communicate with them without words. "He never said anything, it was just the eyes," one girl will recount of the creature. Through those eyes, she sensed feelings and images rather than hearing a voice. Children spoke of an overwhelming feeling that something was wrong with the environment, a kind of telepathic message that humans needed to take care of the planet. Many of them didn't fully understand it, but they all felt deeply unsettled. After what felt like an eternity, but perhaps was only 10 to 15 minutes in reality, the mysterious beings retreated. The metallic disc rose up from the bush and streaked away into the sky. When it was all gone, the children ran back to safety in a complete state of shock. Some crying, some deathly quiet, others babbling excitedly about what they had just witnessed. No adults had seen the encounter, so the shaking students had only each other to turn to for comfort and confirmation. When the bell rang, the children rushed back to their classrooms in a clamor of voices. Dozens of students began telling their teachers an astonishing story of a spaceship and little men on the playground. The faculty, caught off guard initially, dismissed the accounts as childhood imagination or perhaps a prank. Teachers tried to restore order and continue with lessons, but the kids were too afraid, too agitated. They couldn't stop talking about what they had just seen. Many were crying. Some were afraid to go back outside. With skepticism, the staff kept the students in class and did not immediately investigate the field. That afternoon, however, the story refused to fade. Each child who was questioned recounted strikingly similar details. a bright metallic disc coming from the sky. Strange, small beings with huge eyes and an intense feeling of fear. Not all of the 110 children on the playground had seen the phenomenon. Some had been playing on the other side of the building, but 62 children insisted what they had witnessed was real, something inexplicable. School ended early for the weekend, but the events of that recess were on everyone's mind. When the students got home, they poured out their stories to their parents. Imagine the shock of local mothers and fathers hearing dozens of children separately describing the same bizarre encounter. By that evening, countless dinner table conversations in the community revolved around UFO at Ariel School. Many parents were alarmed. If this was a mass hallucination or a dangerous intruder on the playground, they wanted to know what was going on. The next morning, scores of parents showed up at the school, demanding to discuss what had happened. Word of the incident spread quickly beyond the school's community. Zimbabwe's national radio, ZBC, aired reports of strange sightings at the school, after astonished callers phoned in with what their children had told them. It didn't take long for the media and UFO investigators to take interest. Just 3 days later, on September 19th, the BBC's Africa correspondent Tim Leach arrived at Ariel School with a camera crew. He interviewed teachers and many of the children who, on camera, earnestly retold their encounter with consistent, vivid details. The usually hardened journalist was left rattled. I could handle war zones, but I couldn't handle this. Hearing these sincere young voices describing otherworldly beings was more unsettling to him than reports from the battlefield. Local UFO researcher Cynthia Hind also rushed to the scene. Hind had been tracking a wave of UFO reports in southern Africa that week. Just 2 nights prior, a bright fireball, a re-entering Russian rocket, had crossed the skies, sparking UFO buzz in the region. But nothing could have prepared her for the Ariel School case. On September 20th, Hind visited the school and began a methodological inquiry. She separated the students into small groups, 4 to 6 at the time, and had each student recount what had happened, while others listened in turn. She also gave the children paper and crayons and asked them to draw what they saw. What you are seeing on the screen now is one of the drawings by an Ariel School student depicts a saucer-shaped craft hovering among the trees near the playground. The drawings that the children produced were strikingly uniform. In crayon and pencil, many sketched a classic flying saucer, a disc with a dome top, often drawn next to the row of gum trees at the edge of the school grounds. Several drawings included one or more figures with black eyes standing on top or beside the craft. None of the kids' pictures resembled an airplane or a known person. They were eerily similar depictions of something very strange. Hind was impressed by the consistency of the accounts. The children told me all the same story, she reported, amazed at how many students from different backgrounds described nearly identical events. Notably, she observed that many of the children, many of whom lived on remote farms, had very little exposure to science fiction media, making a coordinated hoax or imagined scenario less likely in her view. The children's cultural backgrounds did shape how they interpreted the beings, however. Ariel was a multicultural school with black, white, and Asian students, and each child struggled to fit the bizarre encounter into their own frame of reference. One white student recalled at first thinking that the short little man in black was just a school groundskeeper until he noticed the figure's long, straight hair and unusual appearance, unlike any person he knew. Some of the black African students thought that the creature might be an evil goblin spirit named Zavikwambo, and were terrified that they could be attacked or even eaten, bursting into tears just from the thought. Despite these different interpretations, the core details remain consistent across all testimonies. By October 1994, news of the Ariel School encounter had traveled across the globe. The story of innocent schoolchildren witnessing aliens intrigued many, including the late Dr. John E. Mack, a professor of psychiatry at Harvard University. Dr. Mack was no ordinary academic. He was a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and respected psychiatrist, but he had also become famous and somewhat controversial for his research into UFO abduction claims. Hearing of the Ruwa case, Mack was fascinated by the sheer number of young witnesses and the emotional credibility of their accounts. At Cynthia Hind's invitation, he flew to Zimbabwe in November 1994 to personally interview the Ariel School students. Over several days, Dr. Mack spoke one-on-one with the children in depth. He wanted to probe their perceptions and look for any signs of fantasy or coaching. Instead, he found the children remarkably consistent and sincere. They vividly repeated what they had seen, and many showed lingering fear or awe as they did so. Importantly, Mac's gentle, validating approach made the children comfortable enough to share even the strangest aspects of their experience. It was during Mac's interview that the students elaborated on the silent messages they felt during the encounter. Several children told Dr. Mack that while staring into the entity's large eyes, thoughts entered their minds. Thoughts about the environment, technology, and the future. One girl, when asked how the communication happened, said, "It was just the eyes. He never said anything. I just felt it." Mac pressed her on what the feeling she got was, and she answered that it was as if the being was interested in them. Another student, a 5th grade boy named Francis, said that he had received a warning about environmental harm, as if something's going to happen, and that pollution mustn't be. Emma, a girl about 11, similarly told Mac that we're actually making harm on this world and we mustn't get too technologically advanced, conveying that humans should be careful with technology. In simpler terms, the children reported that the beings delivered an urgent plea: humans need to take better care of the earth. Dr. Mack was deeply moved by the depth of emotion and conviction in the kids' testimonies. He later said that he unequivocally believed the children, finding their honesty and lack of guile compelling. In his assessment, these youngsters had experienced something profound, something well beyond the scope of a schoolyard prank or mass hysteria. Mack, who had interviewed many alleged alien abductees, considered the Ariel School case, and quote, one of the most credible encounters he had ever investigated. He noted that these children showed no signs of lying or fantasy. Many were actually reluctant or frightened to talk until gently encouraged, and none gained anything from sharing their story except unwanted attention. His professional opinion was that something extremely unusual had genuinely occurred to them, even if he couldn't explain what. One of the most haunting aspects of the Ariel School incident is the thematic message that the children reported. Unlike many UFO sightings, this encounter wasn't just lights in the sky. It carried what appeared to be an apocalyptic warning. Multiple students independently spoke about how the experience made them feel that, quote, we are harming the planet, and that, quote, we need to take better care of the environment. This is an unusual thing for young children to assert, especially in 1994 Zimbabwe, where topics like pollution or environmental destruction were not everyday school subjects. Yet the Ariel witnesses, in the days and weeks after the encounter, consistently mentioned this urgent sense of concern that they felt had been implanted into their minds by the visitors. One girl described it as a kind of vision or thought that overcame her when she locked eyes with the being. Quote, once we got that eye connection, everything else around us just seemed to disappear. She said of the moment, that's when I started feeling the messages. It wasn't just talking, it was almost telepathic. It was just a feeling, this overwhelming feeling of how important the environment is. Another child said it felt like the being was showing them images of the earth in trouble, forests burning, air pollution, and people dying, and that we shouldn't be so technology focused and we should care for the planet. Whether these impressions came from the children's own imaginations or from the entities is impossible to verify. However, the uniformity of the theme across so many interviews is striking. For the community and investigators, this environmental message carried a heavy weight. Some interpreted it as a benevolent warning from advanced beings, as if the visitors had come not to harm the children, but to deliver a plea for Earth's future through them. Indeed, this parallels other famous UFO alien encounter reports where witnesses claim to receive warnings about nuclear weapons or environmental collapse. It's almost mythic, the idea that outsiders might be alarmed by how humans treat their world. On the other hand, skeptics argue that the message's content may reveal more about human psychology than alien intent. They suggest that the kids could have absorbed growing global concerns about the environment, or were prompted by adult interviewers and subconsciously wove that into their experience. Was the Ariel incident a genuine close encounter with a cautionary purpose, or a case of young minds projecting collective worries onto a strange sight? This question remains one of the most fascinating aspects of the case. From the moment the Ariel story broke, people have struggled to explain what really happened. Skeptics have proposed a range of theories, trying to demystify the frightening encounter. Here are some of the leading explanations that have been debated. Mass hysteria or shared delusion. One hypothesis is that this was a classic case of mass hysteria in a schoolyard setting. According to this idea, perhaps one or two children thought they saw something unusual and panicked, and their fear spread rapidly to the other children. In the excitement, their imaginations could have fed off of each other, snowballing into a full-blown shared narrative. Supporters of this theory point out that children are impressionable and that Hines group interviews might have allowed the stories to cross-contaminate as each child overheard others. What started as an imagined rumor could have quickly been accepted as reality by dozens of kids simultaneously. Prior UFO fever. Just 48 hours before the Ariel sighting, people across southern Africa reported unusual lights in the night sky, which we now know were caused by the fiery re-entry of a rocket booster from a satellite launch. Zimbabwe radio shows were buzzing with talk of UFOs that week. Skeptics suggest that this media hype primed the children's minds. By Friday, many of the Ariel students had heard adults talking about UFOs or seen news about the fireball in the sky. In that charged atmosphere, it's argued the kids might have been eager to spot something strange and could have misinterpreted an ordinary stimulus, like a flash of light or a moving shadow, as the UFO they've been hearing about. Hoax or prank gone wrong. An alternative explanation is that some of the children made the story up. In fact, nearly 30 years later, a former Ariel student named Dallin claimed that he and a friend invented the whole UFO tale as a prank. In a 2023 Netflix documentary, this individual said that they pointed at a distant shining rock and convinced younger kids that it was a spaceship just to get out of class. And to their surprise, quote, within half an hour all the kids were talking about it, turning their joke into a mass panic. If true, this is a startling confession that could explain everything as a schoolboy's trick. However, many of the other witnesses vehemently reject this claim. Dallin's account also contradicts his own earlier statement. Years prior, he had described seeing a craft with flashing lights, which doesn't match the shiny rock story. To most of the Ariel kids, now adults, the hoax allegation doesn't hold water. They insist that they saw what they saw, and that if a classmate were just pretending, it doesn't explain the intense fear and consistency shared by so many children. Interviewer influence. Critics have also scrutinized the role of investigators like Cynthia Hind and Dr. Mack because Mack's interviews happened 2 months later. Some suggest that by then, the children had been influenced by all of the UFO attention. Notably, the telepathic environmental message aspect of the story only clearly emerged during Mack's sessions. It was not prominently reported in the first few days. Brian Dunning, a skeptic researcher, argues that Mack, a well-known environmentalist himself, may have asked leading questions or unintentionally guided the children to articulate the environmental theme. In other words, the children might have picked up on what the adult interviewers seemed to expect or approve of. Hind's group interviews, too, might have caused the children's narrative to converge on a single storyline, as they listened to each other and agreed. These critics don't necessarily accuse anyone of bad faith, but they caution that child testimony is highly suggestible, and both the excitement of the moment and the later interviews could have shaped the final version of the story. Each of these theories attempts to explain the Ariel encounter without invoking the paranormal, yet none of them fully account for all of the strange details and the emotional force of the children's testimony. For every skeptic's argument, there is a counterpoint raised by investigators or the witnesses themselves. The result is a case that remains hotly debated. Was this just a perfect storm of youthful imagination and suggestion, or did something truly beyond our understanding visit the schoolyard? The Ariel School incident did not fade away as a forgotten folktale. It left a long-lasting mark on those involved and on UFO research history. In the weeks after September 16, 1994, the students gradually returned to normal school life. But many were deeply affected by what they believed they had seen. Some had nightmares, others were afraid that the beings might come back. In one interview shortly after the event, a young girl named Lucille is visibly trembling as she recounts her story. "I worry that the man is still looking at me," she admits, "and he is going to kill me." This lingering fear just shows you how real the encounter was to these children. As time went on, the students grew up and went their separate ways around the world. Yet, remarkably, many of them still stand by their experience decades later. In a 2014 follow-up by the Mail and Guardian, one former Ariel student, now an adult, confessed that she still fears the entities might return and even claims that she can sense when they are back in the atmosphere. Another witness, Emily Trim, has created haunting paintings depicting the creatures in swirling colors. She calls her artwork a manifestation of the messages the beings gave her about caring for Earth. Far from fading, the Ariel encounter seems to have remained a defining moment in these individuals' lives. For some, it opened up a lifelong curiosity about the cosmos. For others, it left psychological scars of anxiety and awe. The case has also solidified its place in UFO lore. It is frequently cited by UFOologists as compelling evidence that UFO encounters can be credible and even purposeful. The sheer number of witnesses and the coherence of their accounts make it unique. In UFO research circles, Ariel is often mentioned alongside Roswell and other famous incidents as one of the most intriguing sightings of the late 20th century. In 2021, the BBC's Witness History program called it one of the most significant events in UFO history. Several documentaries have revisited the story, including Ariel Phenomenon in 2022 and an episode of Netflix's Encounters in 2023, featuring reunions of the Ariel kids and their reflections as adults. Watching these grown men and women tear up or speak with conviction about what they remember from that day is striking. It is quite clear that something truly profound has impacted their lives forever. Dr. John Mack, up until his passing in 2004, often spoke about Ariel as a highlight of his research. He believed the children and saw their case as a wake-up call and not to dismiss strange experiences too readily. Mack's involvement lent a degree of credibility that forced some skeptics to pause. After all, here was a Harvard psychiatrist willing to stake his reputation on the honesty of these village school kids. The Harvard inquiry into his UFO work concluded with no findings of misconduct, implicitly allowing that studying such phenomenon was a legit pursuit. In a way, the Ariel incident even influenced how researchers approach UFO reports, highlighting the value of collecting drawings, the importance of interviewing child witnesses carefully, and the potential significance of messages or meanings derived from encounters. The 1994 Ariel School UFO incident remains an enigma. For the children and teachers and even parents who lived through it, the day will forever be etched into memory as a moment the extraordinary invaded their normal lives. We are left with a powerful story: innocent children, a remote African schoolyard, a gleaming disc, and dark figures with large, sorrowful eyes sending a warning to humanity. It's a narrative that is both deeply creepy and oddly moving. The emotional weight of the Ariel students' testimony, their terror, their wonder, and their earnest pleas for a better world challenges us to keep an open mind. Perhaps the incident was, as some say, a case of mass imagination, but even if a fraction of their account is real, it implies we are not alone and that our actions on Earth are being watched with concern.
Join our cult of tinfoil hat wearers. Subscribe to our YouTube channel.